Hey guys, welcome back to Russian Liberties Corpus YouTube channel, where we, Alexei Postnikov and Gala Bagatova, are talking about Russian politics, Russian political history, Russian society, and in general we're answering your questions about Russia, current state of Russia, or some historical tendencies that took place. Can I suggest I would say, very surface level definition of colonialism as I think it exists now in the current discourse when we're talking about colonialism. So how does colonialism work? You have
No, I wouldn't
Okay.
I wouldn't suggest that we right now take a scheme of some concept of colonialism and bring it on the table. What I would suggest instead is to take a certain paradigm of colonialism that is interdisciplinary and bring as optimal quantity of different perspectives how to assess what colonialism is and isn't. I would suggest taking Roisin Healy and Enrico Dal Lago of 2014, because in my understanding they offer the most optimal set of perspectives where and how to look at colonialism. And they have more parameters than that, but I will cite several of them that I think are necessary.
Okay.
One of them is exploitation colonialism. What it means is that's, I would say, economic parameter of what a colonialism is. So there is a metropolis and there is a colony, and the metropolis benefits from exploiting the colonial resources, manpower, economic power, or via trade. So unfair trade.
So let's say we have metropoly that acquiring control over some territory
Economically.
For well, the goal is to extract profit. They still need to control it in one way or another, but the goal is extracting profit or resources.
Yes.
Yes.
That's one aspect. Another aspect is political colonialism. That is acquiring political power over the nation. It doesn't necessarily mean economic profit or benefit through that process, but it means political gain. It's either gaining more power in the region or gaining more security, or actually that's the same. Getting more power, it means getting more security. So, for example, it might be quite an expensive endeavor to acquire certain territory. It may be even an expensive endeavor to maintain power over this territory that would cost you something from your own metropolitan wealth. But you gain political power in that area, you shield your borders in a way, you feel safer, and you gain more presence, and you gain more weight and say in certain international forums, because that's now your presence. Now you are the boss there. We have that motive that again, that doesn't mean necessarily that there won't be any economic benefit from this territory. It just, at the moment, it's not necessarily benefiting you economically, but it gives you certain political gains. That's another type of it. There's also cultural colonialism, when you, as a consequence of political or exploitative colonialism, or both, you extend your language or prescribe your language and culture to another nation, and you occupy it culturally. That the language of your nation becomes the main language of this peripheral state, and subsumes or suppresses the local language, so that people who actually were born there, who were speaking their language, who were who were worshiping their own gods, now have to submit to another culture and follow a different social contract, different social rule. That's also a representation of colonialism, social cultural colonialism.
Okay. So if we go into the question of Soviet Union,
Right.
I would suggest this metaphor of, dropping stone into the water and the circles that, spreading.
Okay.
So the stone falls in Moscow because that's where Soviet elites of the whole Soviet Union were located. And also, when we talk about Soviet Union, I would describe it as those circles of oppression and exploitation.
Okay.
In a way. So we have the very first circle is going to be Russian Soviet Republic, which was kind of a modern day Russia, in the borders of modern day Russia, inside Soviet Union.
Okay.
So I would say generally outside of Moscow, the rest of Russia was really oppressed. The local elites, let's say like Russian regions, did not have a lot of agency. They were more structurally inserted into this some sort of Soviet vertical of power.
Okay.
Then we have the next circle is going to be Soviet republics, and total there was 15 republics, and Russia was one of them.
Mm-hmm.
So 14 other republics, they had their usually national elites who also were a part of the big communist party
Okay.
of Soviet Union, and they had more agency over their controlled territory than, let's say, regional party leader would have inside Russia. Regional meaning not in Moscow.
Right.
And people were the resources were less extracted comparing to, extracting resources from mainland.
Mm-hmm.
Let's call Russian Republic mainland.
Okay.
And generally, on the, everyday life, the quality of life for people was slightly better than it was in Russia, in the mainland.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not talking about political freedoms because nobody had political freedoms in Soviet Union. Let's just,
Okay. But economically, they lived better in your opinion. Okay. So what you're saying right now, if I understand correctly, you say that there was less of the economic or exploitative element in the practice of Soviet colonialism than it used to be in Russian Empire, for example, or other empires that were more economically driven and they were more exhausting for the colonies than Soviet Union's colonies.
In a way, I would say Soviet Union kind of adopted practices of Russian Empire because inside Russian Empire, what we can call colonies, for example, Finland or Poland, Finland and Poland used to have their own parliament, while inside the core Russia, it was unthinkable till 1905, when it was the result of revolution. The creation of Russian parliament was the result of revolution of 1905, 1907, this whole process. So colonies in Russian Empire had more political freedoms within their borders than the Russian mainland itself. In some ways, they kind of adopted this practice when Moscow, where the all power centralized, the whole power of Soviet Union, would not oppress territories of other Soviet republics, meaning not Russia. They would oppress Russia like hardcore, and other republics may be going to be oppressed, let's say 90%.
So you suggest that that's a reverse exploitation. It's the reverse exploitation on the end of Russian average people because they would pay the price of the maintenance of all these peripheral countries, but the elites, the Soviet elites instead, were benefiting out of the entire system as well as the elites of the periphery.
Yeah, and to support that, we have either a broader circle, which is Warsaw Pact, that got formed after World War II. And also after World War II, Baltic countries were occupied by the Soviet Union and included in Soviet Union as part of Soviet Union itself. Even though they were occupied, I'm not arguing that, everyday quality of life in Baltic countries was way better than it was in Russia. And like for someone from like in the middle of nowhere, Russia, you know, like to get to go to, you know, Riga or Tallinn, like any other like Baltic country was like, wow, it's like a trip abroad. It's like a foreign country. And then I would say this is like a very special case inside Soviet Union. And then we have Warsaw Pact countries, which is, you know, Poland, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, also Eastern Germany, of course. The Soviet zone of occupation that turned into Eastern Germany, Berlin Wall. I mean, you probably heard about that. The thing is, all governments in those countries were in this kind of the same party line as Soviet Communistic Party, but inside their countries, they have, I would say, pretty much autonomy till the point when they're not trying to break out from the like a hardcore socialism as it was seen in Soviet Union by Soviet Communistic Party. And that's how we got, you know, the Prague Spring, when it was a socialistic government that kind of had this funny idea of giving a little bit of political freedoms to the people while still staying socialistic. And it was a big no-no from Soviet Union, and they boom tanks in Prague. Really, really bad. So my point is, the quality of life in those countries comparing to Soviet republics or especially Soviet Russia was like, whoa, that was awesome.
So, okay.
In comparison.
Right. So your first point before was concerning more the economic state of the entire nation, or the peripheral nation in comparison to the metropolis. And then now what you're talking about is more about political rights or freedoms, or even the status of these.
I would say political agency of the elites.
Of the elites, so, which is also freedoms or like the extent of the sovereignty of those colonies, right? So that was a little bit loosened.
Yeah.
Right. So it was not so strictly subsumed by the political doctrine of the metropolis, but was loosened up in the process of the development of the USSR and its colonial practices. Is that what you're saying? Right.
Well, basically, yeah. Okay. And now we're talking about the second phase of existence of the USSR, because Warsaw Pact adds to this, you know, theory. It supports my theory that is like the closer you were to Moscow administratively, not geographically, because, you know, like someone in Siberia, in this sense, closer to Moscow than someone in Georgia or Baltic country. The closer you to Moscow, the more you're oppressed.
When you say about the USSR were more this than that, in any aspect, economical, political, social, cultural, or even when we're talking about practices of settlement, like the manpower exchange, we have to understand that this particular country was colonizing countries from different cultural and geographical setting. Central Asia, Caucasus, southwest, northwest. Those are different people. Those are different geopolitical locations, and there was a different social contract with each of them.
That's true.
That's an interesting point. So when
we're talking about Russian Empire, not Soviet Union yet.
Not Soviet, but even when we talk about Soviet Union, as you say, certain political elites had more political authority over their own
I would
region.
say administrative, because
Administrative
politically
power.
they still needed to be
Right,
completely in line with
yes,
communistic
the
party.
doctrine.
Yes.
This doctrine was very clear, but administratively they had different extent of power. They had different reglement. I would say they had different hierarchy of subordination that they can employ to execute their power, and that was also a part of Soviet distinctive feature of how to express their colonial power over the subordinate peripheral states. We have discussed economical and political aspects of Soviet colonialism, and I'm wondering here, and we came to the conclusion that in some aspects it was loosened up, and in some aspects it was tougher. But I'm wondering, what's your opinion about another aspect that I pronounced, socio-cultural? Do you think that USSR was even more oppressive in that regard than Russian Empire? And I have a history about it, a piece of information from that, and also my opinion, but I would like to hear first your position.
So it's kind of a tricky question because, in fact, Russian culture and Russian language became dominant on the definitely Soviet Union, and also were spreading across the Warsaw Pact after World War II. So like people in Czechoslovakia or Poland or Hungary, a lot of them spoke Russian, and of course everybody within the borders of Soviet Union, all the 15 republics, they did speak Russian 100%, and they were studying, schools were in Russian, and so on. But, so how it happened? When Soviet Union just started, it was led by the literally international group of revolutionaries, and they were like Russian, Jews, Georgian, Armenian, and other movements on like local level and other republics also were happening. But the core of Bolsheviks who took power in St. Petersburg and Moscow in 1917, they were not.
They were representing marginal social groups, right? Somebody who were oppressed on the ethnic level during the Russian Empire.
Yeah, we have this whole anti-Semitic narrative. Sometimes when Russian propaganda needs to criticize Bolsheviks, we can get into that weird Russian Empire / Soviet Union, what's in modern Russia relationship in other video, because it's a long story. But when they need to criticize Bolsheviks for something like, oh, look at that, how many Jews? So who destroyed Russian Empire? Right? They suggest in this. Well, the reason that inside Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, who used to be the one party at some point, Russian Workers' Party, there were a lot of Jews indeed, because Russian Empire had a strict law that did not allow Jewish people to settle within certain borders. So they were basically, imprisoned geographically in one or other territory, and they were extremely marginalized because Russian Empire, as other European countries, to be honest, were pretty anti-Semitic for centuries. So here we go. That's why as an oppressed group, Jewish people were really radicalized. And so it happened, that party that had a lot of Jewish members, radical Jewish members, took power in 1917 in the fall. To comparison, there was another revolutionary party called Socialist Revolutionaries, and they were representing peasantry.
Okay.
So they were a party of peasants. They were also revolutionaries with the same, pretty radical, but since they were representing peasants, they were mainly, I would say, Slavic.
Okay.
Because peasants in Russian Empire were also Slavic. Okay, sorry, it was like a little bit historical background.
Okay.
So now we have this group, international group of people who took power in former Russian Empire. They went through civil war, subduing some regions, losing some other. For example, Finland during that time acquired its own independence, still independent, and Finland, I'm really happy for you guys, and I'm kind of envy too. So the main ideology for Lenin and his comrades was internationalism, because their idea of what's going to happen next is going to happen the world socialistic revolution. So they had ideology of internationalism in mind when they were instating their dictatorship of the Russian Communistic Party or Soviet Union Communistic Party in the first half of 1920s. But then Lenin died, and he was the backbone of that, let's say, project. Trotsky, who was also on board with that and was really invested into that idea, lost to Stalin in the power struggle. So he went into exile and then eventually got killed by, basically by Stalin's order. And Stalin, as I think, didn't care about internationalism, ideas, ideology, communism, whatever. He cared only about one thing, and it was like absolute power. So he took this, let's say, the form of proclaiming internationalism, workers' struggle, class struggle, and he used those narratives to maintain in power till he died, and actually he was successful doing that. So my point is, he needed to create the new man, Soviet man, the Soviet people, Soviet person,
Which was Russified.
which was Russified because Russian was the most widespread language. So
And for the army, for the military purposes, right?
Yes.
For the most part, he was not. He was because he didn't really care about ethnic, gender, class aspects of whatever ideology that was behind his policies. He was just busy with the idea of absolute power, and absolute power is backed up by the military power, right? On the first place, who has the guns versus who has the money. So we are the guys who have the guns. And if we want to have the guns that are united, we need one language to give orders to those men.
And to maintain control, you need to have unified everything, including language and culture. And being Georgian, his real name, Stalin's name is Iosif Dzhugashvili. Being Georgian, he chose Russian language and Russian culture for practical reasons, to become this like unifying standard for everybody within Soviet Union borders, and that's I think that's important to understand that, because when we're going to talk about responsibility and, let's say, putting, I would say, labels on certain ethnicities, like for example Russian people did not have say in that, because Russians, as well as all other ethnicities in that time, were not political subjects. They did not have agency to do anything. There were like some rebellions, but that's the only thing they could do.
Okay.
And being probably as a result got killed and sent to Gulag.
Right. So here I have a point, if you don't mind. You mentioned one thing. I think what you have just touched upon is the question of responsibility of a certain ethnic group for the colonial past, at least during the Soviet period of time, from the beginning of Russification. So what happened, Alex just mentioned that there was a group of internationalist or internationalistically driven revolutionaries who actually had the anti-colonial policy in their agenda. In fact, once they came to power, Lenin's party has started the practices of so-called korenizatsiya. Korenizatsiya means the ethnization of the local countries, and the reverse cultural development, I would say anti-decolonization. That means that the local settlers, colonial settlers, from then on, had to study the local language, follow the local practices, and become one of the representatives of the local peoples, right? So instead of Russification, there was a policy of de-Russification and localization of social cultural doctrines. So that was a practice of actual decolonial policy. But and that's when the internationalist rhetoric and political agenda was in place during the Lenin's tenure. But after he died, Stalin has started the practice of Russification, and Alex's point is that it was Stalin's absolute quest for absolute power. There was not much ethnic, class, or national agenda behind his decision to do so, because his main drive was not ethnicity, was not class, it was absolute power.
Yes.
And I cannot deny that, but I have a counter argument here. Because what we're talking right now, we're talking about a matter of responsibility. We're not talking about a matter of Stalin's reasons or rationales behind his decision, or questioning the agency of Russian people at that, or Slavic people at that time, right? But we are talking about a matter of responsibility. And this matter of responsibility is not the same as the matter of guilt. Who's guilty of that?
Right.
Who did that? Who has done it to us? Who needs to be punished? No. The matter of responsibility is more who is in the position to shift the narrative in order to change the situation into reverse. Who is in the position in the hierarchy, in the created social hierarchy, whoever is guilty of doing that, who as a consequence of all these historical and economic and political factors found itself or himself or herself or themselves in the level where they are in the position to shift the discourse. And what kind of discourse do they need to appropriate to change the situation? I think responsibility is not a matter of only about the past, who did it, who's guilty, who's to blame, but it's the introspective, it's the perspective, who is in the position to change the future. And here I think Russian and Slavic people, white Russian people who are ethnically Russian, who speak Russian, who were born anywhere in the Soviet Union, even if they are not guilty of creating this situation where Russification took place and Russian language was imposed onto all other cultures in the periphery, when Russian culture, because language stems from culture too and vice versa, also was imposed in the periphery, I think just because of this happening, Russians are now in the position to take responsibility for changing this situation and decolonize Russian regions and Russian periphery, meaning that the peripheral states, to promote the narrative of respect of national customs, of culture, of language, or recognizing the differences without hierarchical sub-inclusions into Soviet family, a brotherhood of nations, but instead respecting the sovereignty of culture, sovereignty of language, and understanding their responsibility in the perspective of relationship with these countries and their own regions. Instead of thinking, we are not the one to blame, because indeed, it is even a question who was Russians at that time. Were they even white? Who was considered to be Russian? Are we talking about Ruski or about Российский, which are two different Russian words that mean different things. One means citizenship and belonging to the Russian government, and another means ethnically Russian, probably.
Yeah.
Or just something Russian speaking. This is a very vague term that needs to be determined, and it is yet a task for future.
Yeah. Nowadays, I would say there are a lot of confusion between responsibility and guilt, and they so often so intertwined that I think we need to make a completely another video about this, and it's probably going to be our next video, just to not to over.
If we see the comments from our viewers, if you guys are interested in talking about what is collective guilt, what is individual guilt, what is responsibility versus shame and guilt, and how they represent in a political field, if you would like to talk about how Russophobia is different from understanding the privilege of Russian people as, or the responsibility of Russian people for the consequences of Russian colonialism, let's open this conversation. This is a very sensitive topic. I understand that it's a very dangerous topic, but we have to talk about it to make it less explosive, because it's in the air.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, under
there
discussed.
Is like one last very short take on. You mentioned this problem, and we do have this problem between Ruski and Российский in Russian language. Ruski means ethnically, Российский means from Russian Federation, so basically being a citizen of Russian Federation. And the problem with this term, Российский, my problem, that it was kind of invented in the government too, because they did have the problem how to address all the people of Russian Federation who are not all Russians. They came up with this, Россиянин, which is like a citizen of Russia. And I like the concept. The problem is this concept was artificially created and was kind of imposed on people, so it doesn't have so much, roots. And that's why people are still being confused in Russia between these two,
right?
Especially Russians,
right?
Russians, ethnically Russians.
And for American audience, it's also a very interesting parallel, because the United States consists of so many ethnic groups, and to be American doesn't necessarily mean to be. Actually, what does it mean, right? Ethnically, being American doesn't mean anything at all. So, but for Russian, the word in English, Russian, can be pretty incorporating meanings that it might not entail in Russian while speaking.
That's true.
This is very interesting narrative to compare American and Russian as words and what they might mean in terms of nationality, ethnicity, citizenship, cultural belonging, and everything else, to understand, because it's very important for Russian, Ruski mir, Russian world, to understand how it affects people and their identity, how it affects their sense of inclusion, how does it affect their understanding of imaginary community that they belong to, what actually do they belong to, and who they consider themselves. So that's a very interesting topic to raise.
Again, in a very, very conclusion, I'm really sorry this video turned out to be really long, but also I think it's really important discussion to have. What I think is different between, American and Russian right now, that to be an American is to be a part of American nation, while ethnically you can be whoever in the world, and we live in New York, and New York is melting pot of literally every representative from every possible country, I think.
Right.
You can be, Lebanese and be American. You can be, Guatemalan and be American.
Right.
There is no contradiction here, but in Russia, we still have this kind of confusion and contradiction. And I think the reason for that is that Russians, as people of what now is Russian Federation, we're not a nation yet. We never been a nation.
So I would like to conclude this
Yes.
conversation because we went so far from what is Soviet colonialism, but that's a connected point. So we have in this discussion we have considered political aspects of Soviet colonialism. We have considered economic policies very superficially, social cultural doctrines, and raised a question of responsibility. So. Please, guys, if you consider this a meaningful question of the responsibility, ethnicity, citizenship, cultural belonging, and comparing America, the notion of American and Russian as sort of attribute of identity, if you're interested in developing this topic, please drop the comment down below, ask your questions, offer your counter arguments, and we would be more than happy to film another video, a full-fledged video dedicated to the question of responsibility, ethnicity, and Russianness in the next video. But until then...
Yeah. Again, like this video if you liked this video, share it, show it to your friends, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell. I think that's all what we need to say in the end of the video. A mandatory saying, really sorry about that. Sorry the video was too long, but I think it's interesting and we just like to have a discussion. And we kind of had a discussion here, so please join us.
Yeah, argue with us.
Yeah. And till the next time, bye.
Bye-bye.